The door would not move. I pressed my palms flat against the wood and pushed with everything I had, and the door did not move even a millimeter. The darkness inside the closet was absolute, the kind of darkness that has weight to it, that presses back against your eye and makes you wonder, in the first irrational second, whether you have gone blind. I could smell cedar and dry cleaning plastic and the faint chemical sweetness of mothballs. I could hear, muffled through the thick door and the stone wall beyond it, the sound of a string quartet playing something delicate and expensive. I could hear, closer, the sound of heels clicking away down a corridor, and I could hear, just barely, the sound of laughter. Not kind laughter, not the laughter of people who have heard something funny, the laughter of people who have done something they find delicious. "Let her stay in there," said a voice I recognized, Cordelia. Her voice had a particular texture, smooth on the surface, with something serrated moving underneath it. Plebeians don't belong at altars. She can listen to the ceremony through the wall. More laughter, retreating footsteps, and then silence. What would you do if the day you had spent 8 months preparing for, the day you had chosen your flowers and approved your vows, and stood in 3 separate fittings for a dress that made you feel, for the first time in your adult life, like something luminous? If that day began with you locked in a cedar-smelling closet by the man you loved telling himself was noble enough to deserve you, what would you do if you knew with absolute certainty that the women who had put you there were about to walk down an aisle lined with white roses and candlelight, as if they had not just committed a crime? And what would you do if you couldn't have known, could not possibly have imagined, that the quiet, warm-eyed man waiting at the end of that aisle, the man everyone in the chapel thought was a mild-mannered history professor named Adrian Vane, was about to become someone else entirely? That within 12 minutes of realizing you were missing, he would strip away the most patient disguise in European nobility and become the thing he actually was? I did not know any of that, standing in the dark. I only knew that the door would not move and that I was not going to cry. Let me take you back to where this actually started. Not the closet, not the chapel, not even the moment I met him. Let me take you back to a Tuesday morning in the reading room of the Holloway Public Library, where I had worked for 4 years as a reference librarian, and where the most dramatic thing that usually happened before noon was an argument about printer credits. My name is Mara Sutton. I am 29 years old. I grew up in a house with 1 bathroom and a leaking kitchen roof, in a town whose name does not appear on most maps of England. My mother cleaned offices. My father drove a delivery van. They were good people, generous in the way that people who do not have much are often more generous than people who have everything. And they raised me to believe that what you are is not determined by what you own. I believed them. I still believe them. But I will not pretend that spending your adult life watching other people navigate the world with a fluency that money provides without having that fluency yourself is not occasionally exhausting. It is. It is its own kind of fatigue. I worked at the library because I loved books, and because the job was real, and because it asked me to be genuinely useful to actual people, rather than to perform usefulness in some open-plan office where the metrics changed every quarter. I was good at my job. I was very good at it, actually. I could locate any obscure text in under 4 minutes. I could recommend a novel for almost any emotional state a person might arrive in carrying. I knew the name of every regular patron and what they were usually looking for, and in most cases, approximately when they would be back. I was not, by any definition, that Cordelia Ashworth Vane would have recognized impressive. But that is not why Adrian walked into the library on a Tuesday morning in October and asked me where the section on the Habsburg dynasty was kept. He walked in wearing a slightly wrinkled Oxford shirt, not wrinkled in the way of someone who cannot afford dry cleaning, but wrinkled in the way of someone who genuinely forgot about the shirt and only put it on because it was the first one his hand touched in the wardrobe. He had dark eyes with a quality of attention in them that I noticed immediately and tried not to make obvious that I had noticed. He was carrying a worn leather satchel and 2 paperback books, and the expression of a man who is perfectly comfortable existing in a library, which is not as common as you might expect. I told him where the Habsburg section was. He thanked me without performing gratitude, which is rarer than it sounds. He came back the following Tuesday, and the one after that, and then one Thursday, which was not his usual day. And I remember noticing the deviation, and then noticing that I had noticed it, and deciding this was not worth examining. He asked my name on the 5th visit. I told him. He said it was a good name, direct, no unnecessary letters. I said that was an unusual compliment. He said he had a professional appreciation for precision, being a history teacher. I said history required precision and imagination in equal measure, which was a contradiction most disciplines didn't survive. He looked at me for a moment in the way people look when something lands slightly differently than they expected it to. He asked if I wanted to have coffee. I said yes. The coffee became dinner. The dinner became a walk along the river that lasted 2 hours longer than either of us planned. The walk became a habit, and the habit became the shape of my weeks. And somewhere inside that shape, without ceremony or announcement, I fell in love with Adrian Vane. He told me he taught history at a secondary school in Wiltshire. He told me he had grown up in a large family with complicated dynamics, which made me smile because it was such a careful way of putting it. He told me he lived quietly and traveled occasionally for research. He drove a modest car, a dark green Volvo with a crack in the passenger seat's leather and a back seat full of papers. He wore a watch that was clean and simple and looked old. He took me to dinner at places that were good without being ostentatious. He listened when I spoke. He remembered things I said weeks after I said them and referenced them in ways that made me feel, at a cellular level, that I had been genuinely heard. I told him about my parents, about the library, about the town I grew up in, and the roof that leaked, and the particular pleasure of finding exactly the right book for a person who did not know they needed it. He listened to all of it as if it were worth listening to. He never talked about money, not in the way of avoiding it, and not in the way of being careless with it, simply as though it were not the organizing principle of conversation, which, I had come to understand, is actually a luxury in itself. But I did not examine that too closely because he felt genuine, and genuineness had become the thing I valued most in people and found least often. He met my parents in February. He shook my father's hand and sat in our kitchen and ate my mother's shepherd's pie and asked my father about the delivery routes, the specific geography of them, the way the roads changed in different seasons, the villages that appeared on no GPS, with a curiosity that was entirely real. My mother, who was a human lie detector and who had expressed reserved skepticism about every man I had ever dated, pulled me aside after dinner and said simply, "That one is real, Mara." I said I thought so too. He proposed in the library. He came in on a Thursday, again off pattern, and again I noticed. And he walked up to the reference desk and he placed a small dark blue box on the counter between us. And he said, quietly, with no audience and no staging, "I would like to spend the rest of my life talking to you about books and history and leaking roofs, if you would be willing." The ring inside the box was extraordinary. It was an oval deep blue sapphire set in platinum, surrounded by small white diamonds, arranged in a floral motif that looked like something from a portrait hanging in a very old house. It was not, I now understand, a ring purchased from a jeweler. It was an heirloom. I thought at the time that it must have belonged to his grandmother. I said yes. I said it the way I say things that are true, without preamble, without qualification. I said yes. The problems began approximately 48 hours after the engagement, when I met his sisters for the first time. Adrian had 3 sisters. He had warned me about this, in the way people warn you about a flight being slightly delayed, with the implication that it is inconvenient, but manageable, and will certainly not ruin the journey. He said they were a particular kind of person, and that they had strong opinions about things that don't always matter. He said this in a tone of voice that I later understood was the most significant understatement of our entire relationship. Cordelia Ashworth Vane was 35. She was the eldest, and she wore this fact like a piece of armor she had been polishing since birth. She was tall, angular, and dressed with a precision that suggested a personal stylist, and at least one additional staff member whose job it was to ensure that no thread was ever, under any circumstance, out of place. The day I met her, she was wearing a white cashmere turtleneck, wide-leg ivory trousers, and cream-colored Bottega Veneta mules. She looked at me across the restaurant table, and her eyes made a single sweep of my outfit. A blue midi dress I had bought in the sale at a department store, good shoes, my grandmother's pearl earrings, and her expression adjusted by approximately 2 millimeters in a way that communicated absolute volumes. "So you work at a library," she said. Not a question. "A classification." "I'm a reference librarian," I said. She reached for her sparkling water. Adrian has always had eclectic taste. The second sister, Isolde, was 32. She had the same high cheekbones as Adrian, the same dark hair, but in her face the family beauty had been arranged into something that was less warm and more architectural. She was engaged to the heir of a shipping conglomerate and spoke about this fact with the casual frequency of someone running a ticker tape through every conversation. She had a habit of asking questions she already knew the answers to, for the purpose of establishing the answer in public. "What did your family do, Mara?" she asked over the starter. "My mother cleaned offices," I said clearly. "My father drove deliveries." The silence that followed was the kind designed to be uncomfortable. "How wonderful," Isolde said, "that you found your footing." The third sister, Petra, was 27, and the most dangerous of the three because she performed friendliness. She smiled at me constantly. She asked questions with the body language of genuine interest, and then she repeated the answers to other people in rooms where I was not present, in contexts that reframed them as amusing inadequacies. I discovered this through Adrian's cousin B, who was the only person in that family constellation who treated me like a human being and who pulled me aside at an engagement party 3 months in to whisper, "Petra told everyone at last week's dinner that your parents couldn't afford to come to the engagement party, which is a lie, and that you were embarrassed about it." My parents had been unable to come because my father had a hospital appointment that week. It was not embarrassment. It was a medical appointment. Petra had taken a fact, removed its context, and repackaged it as evidence of shame. I told Adrian. He pressed his lips together and said he would speak to Petra. I do not know if he did. The behavior did not change. And here is where things became complicated in the way that is harder to explain than simple cruelty. Adrian was not unkind to me. He was never cold, never dismissive, never the kind of man who makes you feel small in private. But he had a blind spot the size of a cathedral when it came to his sisters, and in its shadow, they grew bolder every week. Cordelia began calling me the librarian in front of mixed company. Not rudely, plausibly, she could have argued it was simply an identifier. But the tone was the point, the tone that made it a category rather than a person. Isolde sent me a wedding planning article about how to budget a ceremony when one family has significantly more resources than the other, with a note saying she thought I might find it helpful. Petra created a shared group chat for wedding planning that included everyone except me. And then, when I discovered it through B, claimed it was an accident and said she would add me right away, and never did. And Adrian, warm, real, genuinely loving Adrian, said each time I brought these things to him, "They're adjusting. This is a big change for them. Give it time." Time, it turned out, was the one resource I was being depleted of. The wedding was planned for the 14th of March at Ashworth House, the Vane family's estate in Wiltshire, which I had been told was a large period property. When I saw it for the first time, I revised large period property upward considerably. It was a Baroque manor house with a south-facing formal garden, a private chapel dating from the 16th century, a stable block, and a staff of at least 12 people that I counted before I stopped counting. The grounds ran to several hundred acres. The chapel alone seated 180. I asked Adrian again about his family. He said they were old money, complicated history. He said it the way people say something that is true, but incomplete. I did not push. I trusted him. I trusted him completely. That trust was not misplaced. That is the important thing to understand. What came later did not make the trust wrong. It simply made the picture larger than I had been shown. The morning of the wedding began well. I dressed in a room in the east wing of the house, with B as my sole ally and witness. And the dress, ivory silk with a low back and a train that moved like water, was everything I had imagined it would be. B zipped the back and stepped back and said, "Mara, you look like someone painted you." I felt it. For the first time in months of being cataloged and diminished and assessed and found wanting, I felt it. And then Cordelia knocked on the door. She came in with Isolde and Petra, which should have been a signal, 3 of them, where one would have been the conventional courtesy of a bridesmaid checking on a bride. They were dressed in the deep burgundy bridesmaid gowns, custom made. They had reminded me several times at a couturier in Paris, and they looked polished and coordinated, and underneath the silk and the pearls, absolutely purposeful. "We need to show you something," Cordelia said. "Down the hall, there's an issue with the floral arrangement in the alcove, and we need your approval before the guests arrive." B looked at me. I looked at B. Something moved in the air between us, a quick, instinctive uncertainty, but there was no reason, in the logical structure of the moment, to refuse. It was a floral arrangement. I was the bride. I should approve it. I followed them into the corridor. The corridor was long and stone-flagged and lit by wall sconces that threw warm yellow light in alternating pools across the floor. I walked behind Cordelia, with Isolde on my left and Petra slightly behind me, and I had just noticed that we had walked past the alcove. There was no floral arrangement. The alcove was empty. When Cordelia opened a door in the wall to my right and said, "In here," I looked through the doorway. It was a storage room, shelves of linens, cedar-lined walls, dark. "There's nothing in there," I said. "No," Cordelia agreed. And then Isolde's hand was on my back, a flat, firm push, and I stumbled forward through the doorway, and the door closed behind me, and I heard the slide of a bolt. For a moment, I stood completely still. I processed it in stages, the way you process things that your brain refuses to accept, in one piece. I pushed the door. It did not move. I pushed harder. Nothing. "Cordelia," I said. My voice was level. I was already choosing to keep it level. Her voice came through the door, muffled but clear enough. "The ceremony is in 20 minutes, darling. Don't worry. We'll tell Adrian you got cold feet. It's more dignified for everyone than the truth." "What truth?" I said. "That you don't belong here." A pause. The sound of silk moving in the corridor. "Plebeians don't belong at altars. You should have understood that from the beginning. We were simply waiting for the right moment to explain it." I heard laughter. I heard heels on stone. I heard the muffled perfection of the string quartet, somewhere distant, beginning to play. And I stood in the dark, and I breathed. I did not panic. I want you to understand this, because it is important, and because people tend to assume that being locked in a dark room is the kind of thing that breaks a person. It did not break me. What it did was clarify something I had been circling for months without quite looking at directly. It clarified that I had been operating on good faith in a theater that did not deserve it, that I had been adjusting my behavior, my language, my presence, making myself smaller and quieter and more palatable in service of an acceptance that was never going to come. Not because I was insufficient, but because Cordelia and Isolde and Petra had decided, long before they met me, that no one Adrian chose independently would ever be sufficient. I pushed the door again. Then I looked for a light switch. I found one eventually, and a single overhead bulb came on, weak, yellowed, illuminating the rows of folded linen and the cedar shelves and the very ordinary dimensions of my imprisonment. I sat down on a cedar chest in the center of the room. I waited. What I didn't know, sitting in that storage room in a silk wedding dress on the 14th of March, was what was happening at the other end of the manor house. The guests had begun arriving 40 minutes earlier. 123 people, seated in the chapel rows on ivory cushioned chairs with small arrangements of white roses at each end. A flower girl from Adrian's extended family in a white dress with a satin sash, the scent of candles and cut flowers and old stone. An organist who had been replaced at Adrian's specific request by the string quartet because he knew I found organs overwhelming. He had thought of that. He had thought of that months ago when we were planning. Adrian stood at the front of the chapel beside his best man, his cousin from his mother's side, a quiet man named Thomas, who was the only person in the Vane family, besides B, who had ever shaken my hand as if it meant something. Adrian was wearing a charcoal morning suit that fit him with a precision that I had, at the time of our first fitting appointment, attributed simply to good tailoring. He was calm. He was, by all accounts, the picture of a composed groom on his wedding day. And then the music changed to the processional, and no one appeared at the back of the chapel. The string quartet played through to the end of the first movement. Thomas leaned toward Adrian and said something. Adrian's expression, according to B, who was seated in the third row and watching all of this with the attention of someone who had already begun to suspect something was wrong, did not crack. It went still. The stillness was different from calm. He turned to Thomas and he said very quietly, "Where is she?" Thomas said he did not know. Adrian looked at the back of the chapel. He looked at his sisters, seated in the front row, Cordelia, Isolde, Petra, arranged like a triptych in their burgundy silk, watching the empty aisle with expressions of composed satisfaction that, B said later, made her stomach drop. Adrian looked at his sisters for precisely 4 seconds, and then he left the altar. He walked down the chapel aisle in the opposite direction from every expectation the room had constructed around him. He pushed open the chapel doors. He walked out into the corridor. And the man who walked out was not quite the man who had walked in. I have thought about this moment many times since that day, about what it looks like when someone who has been very carefully performing restraint stops performing it. It is not, in the way of films, always loud. Sometimes it is very quiet. Sometimes it is simply a change in the way a person occupies their own body, a shift in the weight of their presence, a clarity in the line of their jaw, a quality in their eyes that makes the air in a room organize itself differently. This is what B said she saw in Adrian in the 2 seconds before he left the chapel. She said, "He looked like someone had taken off a coat. He looked like himself, Mara, but a version of himself that I had never quite seen before." He did not walk quickly. He moved through the corridor with the particular deliberateness of someone who knows exactly where they are going and is not wasting a single step. He passed the alcove with its empty floral stand. He passed the portrait gallery. He turned into the east wing, and then he stopped in the corridor, and he said, in a voice that was not raised, that was, in fact, remarkably quiet, a single word into the air of the empty hallway. "Garrett." A man appeared from the end of the corridor, not from a doorway, simply appeared, materializing from a shadow in the way of someone who had been standing in it, very still, for a very long time. He was broad-shouldered and wearing a dark suit that was not quite the same texture as a regular wedding guest's suit. He had an earpiece. He had the hands of someone trained to use them. "Sir," Garrett said. "Find her," Adrian said. "She's in this house. Find her now." What happened in the next 6 minutes, I experienced only partially in real time from inside the cedar-smelling storage room. I heard footsteps in the corridor, multiple sets, moving with coordination. I heard voices, low and professional. I heard at one point what sounded like a door further down the hall being opened and closed. I was standing at the door, my palm flat against the wood, when I heard them. Footsteps, different from the others, slower, more deliberate. The kind of footsteps that do not hurry because they do not need to. A pause, and then Adrian's voice, directly through the door, at a normal conversational volume, as if we were separated by nothing more than a kitchen counter. "Mara." "Adrian," I said. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Step back from the door." I stepped back. What happened next I have replayed in my memory with the forensic attention I usually reserve for particularly complex reference queries. The door did not open. It did not rattle or shake or demonstrate any sign of the bolt giving way through conventional mechanical failure. What happened was that there was a sound, a sharp, compressive sound, like a joint being reset, and the door came off its upper hinge, tilting inward at a sharp angle, and Adrian pushed it the rest of the way with one arm and walked through the gap into the storage room. He was still wearing his morning suit. His hair was very slightly disordered. His face was entirely composed. He looked at me for a moment, standing in the storage room in my ivory silk dress, with the cedar light overhead and my shoulders very straight, because I had made a decision while I was waiting that I was not going to look anything other than composed when this door opened, and something moved across his face that I did not have a word for. It was not relief exactly. It was something older and more complicated than relief. He held out his hand. "I am sorry," he said, "for all of it. For longer than you know." I looked at his hand. I looked at his face. I took his hand. He led me out of the storage room and into the corridor, and the corridor was not empty. There were 6 men in dark suits arranged along the walls, all of them with the quality of Garrett. The earpieces, the hands, the specific kind of stillness that is actually a very controlled form of readiness. They parted as we walked through. "Who are these people?" I asked, very quietly. "My household security," Adrian said. "Your household security?" "Yes." We walked in silence for 3 steps. "Adrian," I said. "Yes." "What is your household?" He stopped walking. He turned to look at me. And in that moment, standing in the portrait gallery of Ashworth House, with the afternoon light falling through the tall windows in long gold rectangles across the stone floor, I saw his face change in the way B had tried to describe to me later. The coat coming off, the man underneath it. "My full name," he said, "is Adrian Leopold Vane Ashworth Conradi, 7th Duke of Conradi and Sovereign Liege of the Ashworth Protectorate. Hereditary title recognized under the Treaty of Marlenden, 1683, current territorial and financial holding as documented by the Crown Office, of which I am an officer." He paused. The history teacher was not entirely a fiction. "I do love history." I stared at him. "You are a duke," I said. "A sovereign duke," he said. "There's a distinction, legally speaking." "You are a sovereign duke," I said. "Yes." "And your sisters, Our Lady Cordelia, Lady Isolde, and Lady Petra Ashworth Conradi, all of whom are currently, as of approximately 90 seconds ago, being formally placed under investigative hold by the officers of my household for unlawful imprisonment of a person under ducal protection." He said this in the same tone he had used to recommend a book on the 30 Years' War once. Calm, precise. "That would be you," he added, in case I was uncertain. I was not uncertain. I was something beyond uncertain, in a different category altogether. "How long were you planning to tell me?" I said. "Honestly," he said, and the word landed with a weight that was not evasive, but genuinely contrite. "I was going to tell you this morning, before the ceremony. I had the words prepared. And then I discovered you were in a storage room. That changed your timeline." "Somewhat," he agreed. He led me back to the chapel. The guests were still seated, 123 people in ivory-cushioned chapel chairs, in the warm candlelit gold of a 16th century stone chapel with white roses at every aisle end, and among them, seated in the front row in their burgundy silk, Cordelia, Isolde, and Petra, who had not yet understood what was happening. What was happening outside the chapel walls was this: 18 dark SUVs, black, with a crest embossed in silver on each door, the Ashworth Conradi coat of arms, 2 stags rampant on a field of blue, the sovereign star above, had arrived on the grounds of Ashworth House in a convoy that had departed from the estate's secondary entrance and arranged itself in a formation around the front drive. The occupants included 16 members of the Ducal Household Guard, 4 legal officers of the Conradi Protectorate, and 2 representatives of the Crown Office. They were, for the record, not there to make noise. They were there to make things formal. Formality, in the hands of people who are very good at it, is more terrifying than violence. Adrian walked me through the chapel doors. The string quartet, which had been playing ambient pieces for 23 minutes without resolution, stopped when they saw him. 123 heads turned. In the front row, Cordelia's expression began its rearrangement, from composed satisfaction to something less certain, as the two household guard officers who entered behind us took up positions at the chapel's interior door. Adrian brought me to the front of the chapel. He did not speak immediately. He stood at the altar beside me, and he looked at the room with the specific quality of a man who has the time to wait, which is to say, a man who has nothing to prove. Then he said, in a voice that reached the back wall without effort, "I want to thank you all for being here today for what is, unambiguously, still our wedding. We had a brief disruption. It has been resolved." He looked toward the front row. "My sisters will not be remaining for the ceremony. They have prior commitments with my legal office." A pause. Effective immediately, Cordelia stood up. Her face was white beneath her makeup. "Adrian, this is Lady Cordelia." His voice did not change volume. It changed in quality. It became something smooth and absolutely impenetrable. "Sit down or leave voluntarily. Those are the options I am extending to you in recognition of the fact that you are my sister and not simply the person who locked my future wife in a storage room on our wedding day." The chapel was silent, the specific silence of a room full of people who have understood that the world they thought they were in was not the actual world. Cordelia sat down. She did not stay long. Within 4 minutes, the two legal officers had moved to the front pew and had a quiet conversation with all three sisters that involved the presentation of documents. Formal, cream-colored documents with the ducal crest and the words, "Notice of Investigative Detainment under Protectorate Jurisdiction," printed across the top in a font that brooked no ambiguity. Cordelia read it. Her hands were not quite steady. Isolde's face crumpled for a moment into something that might, in a different context, have been grief. Then it assembled itself back into resistance, and the resistance was less convincing than the grief had been. Petra said nothing. Petra, who had spent 18 months smiling and repackaging cruelty as kindness, sat in her burgundy silk and said absolutely nothing. And the absence of her performance was, in its way, more revealing than anything she might have said. They were escorted out of the chapel, all three of them, through a side door, into the waiting presence of the household guard, and out of my wedding, and out of my life, in a single, clean, completely undramatic motion. What happened to them after that is a matter of legal record, most of which is sealed under protectorate jurisdiction. What I know is this: Cordelia, who had been managing a financial consultancy under the indirect patronage of the Ashworth Conradi family holdings, which she had never disclosed to clients, found that patronage withdrawn within 48 hours. Her major client relationships terminated within the week, as the institutions involved were made aware of certain conflicts of interest. Isolde's fiancé, the shipping heir, found that 3 of his company's major port contracts that had been facilitated, it emerged, through introductions made by the Ashworth Conradi legal office, were under review for renegotiation. The engagement was quietly dissolved 2 months later. Petra moved to the south of France and has not, to my knowledge, returned to England. None of them sent apologies. I did not wait for apologies. The ceremony was shorter than planned and more real than anything I had imagined it could be. The 123 guests who remained watched Adrian and me stand at that altar in the candlelight with the white roses and the string quartet, and exchange vows we had written ourselves 6 weeks earlier in his kitchen. His actual kitchen, the private one on the 3rd floor of the London residence, which I had thought at the time was surprisingly grand for a teacher's flat, and which I understood now in its correct context. And the vows said what I felt and what he felt, and none of it required a title or a crest or a convoy of SUVs to be true. At the end of the ceremony, Adrian turned to face the room. He held my hand. He said simply, "Ladies and gentlemen, may I present Mara Sutton, Duchess of Conradi." The room applauded. B, in the 3rd row, was crying in the particular way of someone who is crying from relief and happiness, and the satisfaction of seeing something unjust corrected with precision. Thomas, beside her, was not crying, but he was smiling in the way of a man who has known a long secret and is glad to be done with the keeping of it. I did not cry. I thought about the cedar closet, about the weight of the door, about the sound of heels retreating, about the laughter. I thought about my mother who cleaned offices, about my father who drove a van, about the library reading room and the particular pleasure of finding the exact right thing for a person who did not know they needed it. I thought, none of that is smaller than this. None of it. It is simply a different kind of room. Adrian squeezed my hand. I squeezed back. We walked out of the chapel into the March sunlight, and the 18 black SUVs with the silver crests were arranged in a semicircle on the gravel drive, and the household guard stood at attention in 2 rows, creating a corridor for us to walk through. And I walked through it in my ivory silk dress, holding the hand of the man I loved, who was still the man I had fallen in love with, still the person who drove a slightly cracked Volvo and asked good questions about Habsburg documents and proposed in a library because he knew that was the right room for it. He was simply also a duke. I have thought, in the months since, about what I would say if someone asked me what the point of all this was, what the moral is, or the lesson, or the thing I would want someone else to take from it who found themselves in a cedar-smelling closet on the day that was supposed to be the best of their life. I think it is this: real power does not make noise. It does not argue. It does not defend itself to people who have already decided. It does not beg for a seat at a table it has every right to stand at the head of. Real power is patient and quiet and precise. And when it finally moves, when it stops waiting for cruelty to exhaust itself and simply acts, it does not require your permission or your understanding or your acknowledgement. It simply does what it came to do, and it walks out in the sunlight when it's finished. Cordelia Ashworth Vane locked a librarian in a closet. She did not know she was locking out the woman who, within 6 hours, would be photographed on the steps of Ashworth House under the ducal standard, the silver crest flying in the March wind above her head. She did not know, and she would not have believed it. And that is the most complete justice of all, that the cruelty she was so certain of turned out to be the first step of her own undoing. I went from a cedar closet to a duchess's title in 43 minutes. I kept the library job for another 2 months because the patrons deserved a proper handover, and because Mrs. Okafor, who came in every Wednesday for large print mysteries, would have been devastated by an abrupt departure. Some things matter more than titles. I think Cordelia would find that incomprehensible. I think that is the final difference between us. Now, what did you think of that? Did those bridesmaids get exactly what they deserved for locking a bride in a closet on her own wedding day? Was the moment those legal documents landed in their perfectly manicured hands everything you hoped for? If watching arrogant cruelty get met with absolute, elegant, devastating justice made your day even a little bit better, smash that like button right now. Share this story with every person you know who believes karma is real, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss a single story of power, patience, and the most satisfying revenge the universe knows how to deliver.